Okay. And on that note, let's get the show going. So what this is going to be is we've got what the length of that video end up being, like 18 minutes or so.
It is 17 minutes, 15 seconds.
There we go. So we've got a 17-minute video we're showing here at the beginning, which is all the presentations. Instead of doing them live, we wanted them to all be tightly choreographed. So everybody can sit back and relax, take it all in, and it all kind of is going to speak for itself. And then when it's done at 20 after, we'll have a solid half an hour at least, or 40 minutes of discussion of everybody. So on that note, take it away, Matthew. Let her roll.
Sure.
Welcome to this first ABT metrics mini symposium, of which we'll probably hopefully do several of these, probably every 2 or 3 weeks, as we begin to roll out the new book, LBT, the Lincoln but Trump book. And this is a book that has sort of used this dynamic of these two presidential characters to help bring to life these two new metrics, the and frequency and the narrative index, that you'll hear quite a bit about. So here's what we're going to be going through in this probably 15 minutes or so presentations that we have. Are three main things relative or related to the narrative metrics, which are, first off, the metrics themselves. And they're two simple metrics. The first one is simply how much you're using the word and, the and frequency, the number of ands divided by your total number of words in a document. And the second one is basically how much you're using the word but, which is, we call it the narrative index, and it's the abundance of buts relative to ands, the NI. So that's the two metrics. Then secondly, we'll be looking at patterns that they reveal. And there's no debating these patterns. Let's be crystal clear about that right now. So there are all kinds of patterns. I've spent the past 10 years looking at literally thousands of speeches and articles and essays and books and things like that. And there are all these patterns that arise from these two words, the use of the word but and the use of the word and they're reflective of narrative structure, I think. So no arguing with the patterns. In the book, the two biggest chapters are the chapter 3, that's about the and frequency in the World Bank. I use that case study to kind of establish the use of this metric and the and frequency. And then the chapter after that is about the Lincoln-Douglas debates from 1858, and I use that as a case study to establish the narrative index. Again, there's no arguing with the numbers. They're so simple. I've had other people calculate the same numbers. They come out identical. That part's the objective part. The third thing we'll be getting into is the highly subjective part, which is what exactly does all this mean? And these 5 presentations will be hitting different dimensions of that, the interpretation of the metrics. So here are our 5 short talks. And by the way, please bear with these folks. This is an idea that just came to mind on Friday. So I quickly contacted each of these poor people and said, hey, could you quickly give me 3 minutes of audio? Then I put the images to them. So if you see anything that offends you in the imagery, do not blame them. It is all my fault. And we're all friends here. So we're hopefully having a little bit of fun with each of these topics. And on that note, and last thing to warn you is that these presentations are not ABT structured. That would have taken a couple of weeks to work on them, get them exactly ABT formed. But I think they're good enough, and they're a little rough around the edges, but they're just mostly meant to generate the discussion that we'll have at least a half an hour after we finish the last presentation. So on that note, let's start off with our good buddy, and these are all our ABT team folks. So first off, Park Howell, here we go.
Okay, so on the heels of launching your book, Lincoln but Trump, I decided to run ChatGPT through its paces. I fed it a story. I asked it to give me the and frequency and the narrative index, which it did very easily. And then I asked it to rewrite the story by making the metrics better. So this is a story for, it's about a lady who is in the largest Teachers Retirement Association in the country that I'm going to be working with in a couple weeks. And in there, they tell these stories about retired teachers. And this one was about Laverne Redmond, who produces approximately 250 quilts for middle school children at Miles Independent School District. Redmond is 89 years old and works year-round to make quilts from donated fabric. The quilts are distributed through the school in early December, and they provide a special source of comfort and meaning for the students and their families. It goes on for 5 more paragraphs, blah, 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 and. And when I ran it through, the AF is 3.4%, so lots of ands in there, and the narrative index is 0, not one use of the word but. So I asked ChatGPT. I said, rewrite it now and give me an AF of 2.5 and a narrative index of 20. It says, okay, gladly do that. Means I've got to add 2 buts to the story. So it goes on, it writes it, it's still blah, blah, blah at the very beginning. And then the last couple sentences, it just throws some buts in there just to be able to make that metric work. Then I asked it to take it to a 30 NI, and it did the same story, but the last 4 paragraphs are pretty much one sentence, and it ended with, but it's not always easy. Fabric sometimes runs low, machines break, and the hours are long. But Redmond never complains. She keeps going because every stitch carries meaning. But even with so much impact, she asks not to be celebrated. This isn't about me, she said. I met a woman who said, you used to feed me every day at Miles. That's the honor. That's the legacy. End quote. And then finally, but perhaps the greatest legacy isn't the quilts themselves. It's in the quiet devotion of someone who simply loves and gives. I'm not even sure that second to the last sentence makes sense, but I cracked up to see ChatGPT in order to fill out the narrative index. It just rammed 4 buts in at the end of the story, which tells me maybe it still doesn't quite understand the ABT.
Hello, ABT fans. Andy Reynolds. I'm sorry I can't be with you, but I have what I think is a terrific piece of narrative writing that I'd like to put in front of the group and get your feedback about it. We've been speaking for some time about individual New York Times op-ed writers and the fact that they produce good narrative structure. I think the David French op-ed of May 29 is an excellent piece of narrative writing. But we know in life that you can get too much of a good thing. You can be too rich or too thin. Diminishing returns are a thing. Randy and Matthew have identified that in the narrative sphere, when you get too narrative, you drift into DHY territory, despite, however, yet. Therefore, I'm curious to know if we can use the ABT narrative metrics to know when our narrative has gone too far. That is, when does a high narrative index, an admirably strong but-to-and ratio, when does that become DHY? The David French piece, as I said, it is impressive. Low 2.7% and frequency, and a stratospherically high 38 but-to-and ratio. Maybe we should know that we're in for a strong narrative piece when the first word of the second sentence is but. In these screenshots, I have highlighted in hot pink the many uses of but. I'll come back to that yellow construction there. Actually, while we're here, let's just acknowledge that that yet I'm afraid, ... that phrase essentially counts as an honorary but. The narrative index would be even higher if I had counted that instance as a but. Green, of course, in ABT coding is a therefore statement, and that's a terrific example of it right there. We have nested ABTs all the way down in this piece by David French. Many more buts. This yellow section is interesting because it's not a but it functions that way. It's essentially a on one hand, on the other hand way of introducing contradiction or contrast. On one hand A, on the other hand B. Very clever use of a surreptitious but, if you ask me. The but bombs really fall frequently and often toward the end of the piece. Look here at 1, 2, 3, there are 5 buts in that screenshot alone. You get the idea. Very strong narrative structure all the way down, but I'm curious if it goes too far. Personally, I don't think it does, but I know that there has to be a limit at some point. At some point, a writer hits a ceiling and gets into diminishing returns. I'd like to know if we can use the narrative metrics to know when we've gone too far. When does a strong narrative index get into DHY? Thanks.
Let's look at the narrative metrics for this sentencing memo. When Randy initially forwarded this document to me, as I am very much on the outer circle when it comes to any sort of legal papers, I gave it an initial read through just to get a first impression. That impression, surprisingly to me, was that the paper was fairly easy to follow and made a very clear argument. That in mind, I turned to the numbers. In a document with a total of just a little bit over 3,000 words, I found a total and count of 67. This in turn yielded an and frequency of 2.2%. However, when I turned to the total but count, so the total count for instances of the word but within the paper, that was only 5, which yielded a narrative index score of just 7. This got me wondering because my initial read of the paper before reviewing the numbers didn't exactly align with such a low narrative index score. So I went back into the paper once more to try to understand. This time, I color-coded each statement through the paper to identify whether that statement was one of agreement, contradiction, or conclusion, even if it did not explicitly use the words and, but, or therefore, or any other clear indicator word. In those specific cases, the primary way I identified those statements as and, but, or therefore was to test the statement by adding one of those to the beginning of the sentence and seeing if it still made sense. For example, if I added but to the start of what I perceived as a statement of contradiction and it still read the same way and made sense within the paper, then I could safely assume that it was in fact a statement of contradiction. It was just an implied contradiction. By the end, I'd found an additional 16 statements within the paper where but specifically was not explicitly stated, but was very clearly implied. When I added those implied buts back to the initial but count of 5, those that were explicitly found within the paper, I yielded a new narrative index of 31. Ultimately, what this told me is that the paper was arguing like I'd initially perceived it to be, but it was doing so through implied buts rather than using explicit buts, which was why the narrative index was coming in low, because it was not making that argument explicitly.
I did a case study on a sentencing that I thought was just full of and material and really just no narrative. A lot of missed opportunities. So I decided to run this narrative index. And lo and behold, in the dumps, I was right. Just horrible. But then I was like, well, if I'm going to do this for other people's work, I better do it for mine too. Because if I'm here like teaching everybody how to be these narrative engines, and I'm saying I'm all that in a bag of chips, I better be able to put my money where my mouth is and look at my own work. So I pulled a sentencing memo from a case that I thought I told a really good story in, and I did get a really good result. It was a drug case, and I ran Randy's narrative index, but my scores were fucking horrible. My scores were horrible, like in the dumps. And I was in despair. I was like, I was curled up in the fetal position in a ball on the floor, whimpering. And I didn't know what to do with myself. And I'm like, well, but I thought this was a really good, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I went back to Randy and said, what the fuck, man? And what we found was that um, the narrative index is a great diagnostic tool because it's either going to tell you right off the bat that things are good, or it's going to tell you have a problem and then you have to go figure out what that problem is. And I figured out what my problem was. And the truth is, it wasn't a big problem. There was conflict and contradiction. The buts were all over my pleadings, thank God. But my biggest problem is I just don't say but. When Randy's assistant went through my work and actually highlighted all the red material, all the conflict, all the contradiction, we found that my narrative index was actually extraordinarily high, thank God. Um, but my point is, I probably just needed to say but a little bit more, right? And you don't have to be crazy about it, but it helps to say but, because but draws your attention, but activates the brain, but signals to you that this is really an issue. This is really a contradiction and a consequence. So I personally, therefore, am trying to use but more in my spoken and written work.
This is how we Goldilocks our shareholder letter. I run a closely held software company. I faced a new dilemma. We've always kept information really close to our vest, but a potential partnership meant that we needed to communicate with all the shareholders for the first time in years. My solution was an annual shareholder letter, Warren Buffett style. Our CFO took the first swing, a classic diplomatic letter that scored just 3 on the narrative index. Very safe and very forgettable. I reworked it using the technology contrarian structure, drawing on communication principles I'd studied with the ABT team. The result was a score of 75. When I shared this letter with the management team, something magical happened. They were energized, they were motivated, and they were ready to charge through walls. But here's where it gets interesting. Their enthusiasm led to edits and kind of a committee-like input that dropped our score to 55. I wasn't surprised. I'd seen this pattern before. Committee writing tends to dilute impact. We were ready to send that version when our chairman, a seasoned Wall Street analyst, spotted something his experience told him was a little bit risky. His diplomatic revisions brought us down to a score of 22. Now, 22 might sound low, but for something that diplomatic, it was actually impressive. And here's the key insight. We would never have hit 22 starting from scratch with a diplomatic approach. We needed that high impact 55 as our foundation. Everybody won. The team got their motivational moment, the chairman got his risk management, and we got a letter that balanced impact with prudence. Sometimes the team ABT isn't the world-facing ABT, but that doesn't mean it has to be boring.
Welcome to very cool. Okay. So that is the whole collection of presentations there. As I say, whipped together over the weekend. Great job for all 5 people. Thank you so much for being good sports, jumping in there. And actually, Randy, Julian, as people think about questions and maybe type into the chat window things you want to ask or just ask for chance, Matthew will be watching all that. But Randy, let's start with a couple weeks ago, you wrote a really nice email that towards the end of it, you just in one sentence and in 4 words kind of hit a bullseye like never before in all the stuff that we've done, which was you said the ABT is simple but not easy. And we picked up on that now for the last couple weeks, and it really resonates. That is, we've been doing this for years, and we've been describing it that way, but never quite distilled it all the way down to 4 words. Simple but not easy. You want to tell us where that came from and add a few thoughts there as everybody's getting ready to ask some questions of the presentations?
Yeah, the I'm a competitive tournament chess player, and all of my coaches tell me that that chess is a game that's easy. It's simple in terms of it's simple, but it's not easy. So that was a phrase that
Oh,
I've
wow.
heard a lot. Like you can teach somebody the rules in a few minutes, and then
Yeah.
you can spend the rest of your life trying to get mediocre.
Now that's really interesting because we've drawn on that analogy in the past in terms of in chess, there's a whole bunch of opening moves you can memorize, right? So there's an objective element there at the start, but at some point after what, 3 or 4 or 5 moves, you've got to be able to shift from memorized moves to intuition that you played the game enough that you can feel it. And it is the same thing with the ABT, which is that you can have a template of 3 blanks there that helps a little bit. But at some point, and people are constantly asking us, how does this thing work over the course of 10 pages? You know, I get it for 1 paragraph or 1 sentence. And the answer there is exactly that. The 10 pages is the same as a full game of chess, and the 1 paragraph is the same as your opening moves for chess. Um, yeah, tell us a few more thoughts on how you've been using this. Tell us about your company. I didn't really get a chance to fit in their introductions for all the different characters, so you're one of the newest people to join our group. Give us a couple words about your company, what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a chemist by training. I have a in the chat boxes, right? Scientists have a hard time with but. Um, so I have a PhD in chemistry and worked in computational sciences, and so the company uh, has a product that most of the diagnostic labs in the country use to automate data analysis. So if you've had blood drawn in the last year and had any interesting anything more than your basic blood panel, there's a pretty good chance it went through our software. But we're a small, quiet company that uses AI, but we don't say it. It's sort of like Siri before LLMs became popular. They just did it. They didn't talk about it. And so we've had machine learning and AI in our product for a long time. Um, the thing that I wanted to say about my presentation is that um, in my work, the work that we're doing with the narrative index, um, because we have this engineering background, we actually did the natural language processing to find all the implied buts. So you can take the libraries and write programs to count words, but you can also process them in the context of grammar, and you can find all the implied uh, things. You can basically do what Liz does with the colors. Um, but the thing that was most startling to me, and it's the most surprising outcome of all the work that I've done, both on ABTs and on the narrative index, um, is that there's different ranges of narrative index, regardless of how you count it, for different audiences. And what I learned in the movement from 75, which was really just a rah rah
How
over
many words
enthusiasm.
was that? How many words was that letter?
It's about 1,000.
Yeah, that's usually tends to be our sample size cutoff. When you get below 1,000, you start running the risk of weird
Yeah.
force,
And it's
right?
a weird number anyway. Like I said,
Yeah.
you just take one out and all of a sudden it's different. But um, what I found was that, instruction manuals are below 5, right?
Right. Yes.
But there's a zone, there's a magic zone for um, for institutional competence, and it lives between 5 and 15. So what's interesting about our company is that there's a bunch of significant shareholders who get lots of information and want lots of details. So they're okay with the and. Um, what I tried to do was give them what they needed, but at the same time, I've got a bunch of silent investors who I would just prefer to stay silent. And so the problem with even 22 or let alone 55 turns out to be, well, what's your strategic objective with the communication?
Hmm.
I want the minor investors to feel like we care about them and update them and that we're being transparent, but I don't want a phone call. So I don't want to activate them.
Yeah.
So I deliberately dialed it, even after I made the video, I dialed it back to 15 on purpose to
Yeah.
keep it in the out of the range of, wow, you guys are very exciting. And I like, when are we going to exit? Like, I don't want that question.
Yeah, this has some similarities to what we're doing with the World Bank folks, which is that the World Bank is this bastion of andness, basically, for good reasons, for diplomacy. And they're trying to minimize conflict and contradiction. And so what's evolved over the course of 70 to 80 years there with the World Bank is this whole language called bank speak, which is what that whole Stanford literary lab study was about. And the question we're asking there is it possible to come up with a diplomatic version of the ABT? And I think that's a little bit of what you're talking about there. It is exactly fine tuning, not wanting to have, Trump is the only politician I've come across that shoots up in the 30s over and over again. No other speeches have I ever found that shoot up in the 30s, political speeches. I'm not even sure most of the speechwriters have the capability to do that. There's something different in his programming and the shortcuts and things that I think that he takes that makes it supercharged like that. But you don't want that sort of communication to your shareholders or at the World Bank. And so this has kind of cracked open a whole window of exactly that, the fine tuning and sensitivity of adjusting these things. Park, you want to add a few more words about what do we call it? Butt ramming, a new term that's just arisen here from your presentation there and Chat GPT.
Yeah, I mean, if you type into Chat GPT, Randy Olson's narrative framework, the ABT, it does a pretty good job with it. But if you don't give it that guidance and you just say, okay, now create this based off of the metrics you've given me, it doesn't know to go. I don't believe it doesn't know to go and source your ABT. So it just just randomly threw butts in there. And I just thought it was kind of funny. Sort of naive on his part, but it'll probably get to the point before too long that it's going to be able to dial that in.
Well, and I think that Matthew, you can take over a moment on this, but there's a deeper level that we've evolved with the ABT over the last 3 to 5 years, which is the six-part structure instead of each of the three key elements, and but therefore breaking down to the two sub-elements. And as far as I can tell, ChatGPT has no connection with that at all so far. And we've tried different sorts of things. And Matthew, you want to pick up on that about the sensitivity to the six elements?
Yeah, it's especially element number two that I've noticed ChatGPT has a heck of a problem with. Element number two is the if then, the stakes. It's where you have to project out into the future and think of, okay, in the best case scenario, if everything goes exactly according to plan, what can we expect to have happen from this? How good are things going to be? Who's going to benefit? How much are they going to are they going to benefit? And that sort of like future focused critical thinking is pretty tricky for ChatGPT. Like you have to goad it so much that at the end of the day, you might as well just kind of write that part of it yourself. So,
Yeah,
Matthew, what I will say is our experience in creating a custom uh, AI out of both ChatGPT and Claude 4.0 is you can train it. And it takes a lot of prompting, but it's your own custom version of it. General AI still can't do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things we're up against here, we've evolved into the DNA structure of dream, nightmare, action, and that's fairly counterintuitive to basic human nature. And that's why, starting with all the environmental groups we work with, they are just so deeply literal minded. They start all their ABTs with the problem. They just say the world's melting and we're polluting everything and we're killing everything. And it's really hard for them to go counterintuitive to broader, less literal into setting up the dream before you get to your problem statement because the problem grabs attention with the butt bomb and all that sort of stuff. And as a result, I guess you can start training those things like that. But in the limited experiments that we've done with ChatGPT, there doesn't seem to be any awareness because it'll take your whole thing and it'll start with, the problem in the and stuff and then go the
You
reverse
can
direction.
you can begin with the desired state. You can paint
Yeah.
a utopia
Yeah.
and then basically say, would that we could,
Yeah.
or would that it were. And you can basically end up right back where you need to be.
Yes. But that's what doesn't happen all too often. It's what we generally deal with in the training is most people
Yeah.
start with the more literal minded approach of just going right to the problem. It's understandable. And especially we found this, Mike Strauss and I've done a lot of work with high school kids. And it takes age and experience to develop the ability to understand how to set up context. And setting up the context as the dream is really challenging. And so we spend a lot of time working on that. And that's what we mean by narrative intuition. It will take you quite a long time practice of doing this stuff over and over again to begin to start spotting things like, oh my goodness, this starts off with too negative a tone, I think. Um,
Yeah,
Julie,
there are a lot
yeah.
of words, Randy,
Mhm.
that are both conjunctions and adverbs. and they can basically slot in without butting things.
Okay, but let me now take this in a little bit of a direction, which is um, simplicity versus complexity and objective versus subjective. And this then addresses this explicit versus implicit buts. And the problem that you have that, so as I mentioned there in my little intro thing, the nice thing about those data sets from the World Bank and from the Lincoln Douglas debates and lots of things. At the beginning of the book, I talk about this one editorial from the New York Times the week of the inauguration that they thought was so big and powerful, and the narrative metrics on it are disastrous. And I think Randy Julian here said the first thing he did was he went and found that editorial and ran it for himself. And what did you find, Randy? You got the exact same numbers, same metrics, same scores. There's a power in that replicability of the simplicity of the objective elements of simply dealing with but and and. Now, as soon as you start getting into this explicit implicit thing, I guarantee you, you give it to three different people, and there's such a qualitative thing about is this really an implicit but? And first off, and then the second question we posed at the end of what Liz had presented there was yeah, is there an equivalence between once you've got an implicit and explicit, and there isn't? And we know that the word however is a very diplomatic word because it's not as powerful in contradiction as the word but. But is the but bomb. And we don't know what the formula is. How many howevers does it take to equal a but? And therefore, especially just getting started on this whole approach of using narrative metrics, it's really crucial to pursue the things that are replicable through the simplicity of being objective like that. Now, everybody debate that. Who's got thoughts and comments on that? Yes, Jane. Hey, how you doing?
Hey, I'm good.
Hey,
How are you doing? Long
good.
time no see.
What? Yeah. What time is it there in Switzerland?
It's not too late. It's 7:30 in the evening.
Nice.
And we just had a big storm come through. So I'm happy to be inside at the computer.
Okay, Jane has worked with us for a bunch of years. She's the head of the food packaging forum. And how's everything going?
Great, great. I'm super busy right now. And I'm actually, as we're talking, I'm working on a text that I'm going to present tomorrow at Earth, what's it called? World Environment Day. So I'm one of those environmentalists. And I'm actually just changing my top paragraph to this is what we should be heading towards and not these other problems.
Excellent.
So
Yes.
anyway, what I was thinking, listening to you speak about rules. I also have a history of 15 years improv theater. And one of the things, sorry, but improv works so well because we have rules. If you've ever seen a theater sports show, for example, you get asked as audience, give us three objects, and then they have to play a scene with those three objects, right? They have to play some role in the scene. That's a rule. And what these simple rules do to the audience, they seem like, oh, that's incredibly difficult, and they make up things as they go. No, that's actually wrong. The rules make it easier to improvise because you don't have the whole universe of options in your brain to choose from, right? And I think that's exactly what you were just referring to. By sticking to and but, you have rules that narrow
Yes.
down your
Yes.
thinking and that help you focus. It's kind of counterintuitive, but I do think that it actually works that way.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I think that a lot of that intuition for me comes out of the few years that I did of acting training as well, because you're dealing with all this variability of human behavior, and that's what communication is. And if all you do is just get mystified by, oh, it could be this, could be this, could be this, you get nowhere. You've got to somehow interject that objective element. Matthew, want to call on somebody?
Uh, yes. Michael Rayner, you had something you wanted to add by the looks of things.
Yeah, I was trying to get my head around the kind of ex ante, ex post measurement problem, right? So the legal brief, for example, I think is a great illustration of what the kind of the burr that's under my saddle. So the assessment was ex ante. I wrote this legal brief. I thought it was really good. In fact, there's ex post evidence that it was because this was a tricky situation and I got the result I wanted. So at some level, that's effective communication, right? You achieve the desired outcome. And then the assessment was made, oh no, it's got terrible scores. To which I would say, well, so what at some level, right? I mean, effectiveness is what you're interested in, not achieving high scores, as the GPT example illustrated. And similarly, the observation is that Trump's rhetoric has great scores. I honestly don't have an opinion of whether or not it's good in the sense that the legal brief was assessed to be good, right? So it's a long way of getting to there's a dependent variable here that presumably we can determine ex post this piece of communication was good, that we want the metrics to identify ex ante so that they can tell us before we release it into the wild.
What? Hang on. What ex ante? What? I'm not following that term.
Well, that means beforehand, right? I write something and it sits in my, and it's before I post it to my Substack, that's ex ante, right? When I release it into the
Okay.
wild and I see what kind of effect it has, is it successful, right? Does it achieve what I wanted to achieve? Is it convincing? Does it call people to action? Is it popular, right? However, I'm determining success, right? What I want to know from the metrics is before I hit publish, it says this has a much better chance of being successful than it would have had otherwise. That's what I'm looking for. So ex ante, ex post, right? Just like you build a product for sale, right? You make a widget, you hope everyone buys it. You don't know until you put it up for sale. You want things to tell you before you invest in production that it's going to work. And
Yeah.
I
Okay.
look at the
So
metrics of that.
Mike Strauss, when I first talked with you about this situation with Doug and what he found there, tell us what your take was on that about how these metrics are still valuable.
Yeah. I think they're still valuable because what it did for Doug is it said, okay, um, you may have a problem here, and that's what he said. And then he looked at it, and it really showed that the metrics are a first cut, but you then have to go back and ask why you had to go out and get Doug's case and say, why did that produce that low score? And Liz's piece was the answer to that. So the metrics aren't a final grade, they're an indicator.
No, but I'm questioning why we think that, right? In order to determine that it's an indicator of good prose, we have to ex ante have a definition of what constitutes good prose. We have to have good and bad results. We say here's a stack of things that we deem to be good. Here's a stack of things that we deem to be bad. And then you say when we run them through the metrics, turns out in expectation, not every time, not fail safe, nothing's guaranteed. I get it. But you can say, hey, you know what? There is a statistically significant and practically material difference between the metrics that good prose delivers versus the metrics that bad prose delivers. And in that, right, I beg the question that we can tell the difference between good and bad prose independently of the metrics.
Okay, but hang on.
I mean,
Hang on. You're using the wrong word with prose. This is not about prose. And one of the things I mentioned in the book is a friend of mine who got her first 5 chapters back from her big time editor who said, these are good, but we need you to be more argumentative. And that's what this is all about, is being argumentative, regardless of prose. And I think those are very different words. And it's the idea that this narrative index gives you
Well,
some broad reflection of how argumentative something is. And we know that President Trump is intensely argumentative. We know that an equipment manual is non-argumentative. We've got this correlation to some extent. It's not a super tight correlation, but it's a ballpark estimate of what you're doing. And I guarantee you, anything that's getting over 20 in the narrative index is arguing pretty fiercely. Anything over 30 is, spewing sparks everywhere. So that's what this is about, is argumentation, not about prose. What?
well, I mean, prose is just, I'm not using that in a technical term. That's just for a piece of writing.
Okay, well then let's call it a piece
I
of
mean,
writing.
because it's prose, I'm not talking about poetry, right? I mean,
Yeah, but that's a word that tends to be associated with that. But mostly what we're talking about here is argumentation, I think. And Doug, what are your thoughts back on the in terms of the explicit and implicit and where that led you to?
You know, it's I've just been kind of listening to it, so I'm torn in the sense that, well, first of all, I think I can agree on the baseline that this is a very valuable diagnostic tool, period. And for me, it was okay, didn't come out scores, let's see what. And, you know, thankfully, the proof was in the pudding because I think that, Liz came out of the gate saying, I read this thing and it was clear. and I followed it, and it was compelling. And she's in the outer circle. This was a legal brief. So there's no higher praise than somebody on the outer circle saying, I read your, legal brief in a federal sentencing matter and I got it. And so clearly I'm doing something right. But thank God, right? And I love that you upped the ante because I wasn't just curled up in a fetal position, but you had that guy sucking his thumb, didn't you? You had to just
I had to look hard for that image.
that was beautiful. I love that. It even looked like me. Anywho, and so where I'm torn, where I'm conflicted is how much now would I go back? Like if that were a draft and I was writing a draft and I was going to do the narrative index and I would say, okay, I got a lot of conflict. I got my red material, but I'm not saying but enough. How much am I going to go back and plug in the buts? And that's where I'm struggling because I don't ever want things to look too, I don't want to go overboard, with
Well,
my
that gets into what Park's presentation was about, was the idea ChatGPT will gladly plug in
butt
butts
ramming.
for you, and you'll end up with
We
this
have a
thing.
new term called butt ramming.
Butt ramming,
So
yeah,
how many
exactly.
butts am I going to ram into that
Yeah,
pleading?
exactly.
And
But
Charles
I
is
think the
shaking his
important
head no.
context for all this stuff, and I thank you, Jane, for drawing that parallel with improv because that's very, very relevant. The problem is that we live in a world now of too much information, and not only that, that in the last few months, certain people have figured out now how to really weaponize too much information, and the whole flood the zone thing, which we've been tracing back with where we had Jeannie Scott here 3 or 4 weeks ago to talk about Gish Gallop. And this is a major problem now in our society. And the poor old Democrats have been absolutely blindsided by this flood the zone thing. As soon as it started in January and February, they were all like, what is this? What is this? How did they think this thing up? Well, that's what you do in a world of too much information, too much noise. Anything that can interject a little bit of objectivity, a little bit of a signal of order into all the entropy is potentially really valuable. And I think that's what we're talking about here
Yeah.
is that this narrative index, as simple as it might be, and I'm sure I'm going to get nowhere in the humanities world, except I do have this one advocate with Jerry Graff that you all heard from a couple weeks ago, who's wonderful. He's gotten it from the beginning, but I wanted him to talk a little bit more. He came and spoke to us about his book, They Say, I Say, which is and but basically. It's the same tripartite structure. This book has sold over 3 million copies, is used in humanities courses across the country. But if you look at his plight, he's super popular at the grassroots level, but the higher up you get into the more intellectual, informational crowd, they basically dismiss him the same way that Park got dismissed with the ABT being reductive and insulting. And so it's a gradient you're up against that is just one of the glitches of human brain programming is that when people get super informational in their heads, they just think simplicity is a waste of time. I mean, Michael Rayner, don't you agree with that? You're the guy that I helped you with that talk years ago that was about keep it simple, stupid, that TEDx talk that you gave. I mean, what's your lifelong experience with simplicity?
Well, I mean, as simple as necessary, right? As simple as possible, but no simpler. And that's always the problem. That's what makes it an art, at least in my experience, more than a science. And it's that goes all the way back to Sir William of Ockham, and it's this is a way. I'm just looking at the chat here from Matt. It's the dialing the metric back to saying that this is an indicator of the argumentative nature of your communication is helpful, right? Because I had inferred a stronger claim that
Right.
the metrics will tell you the extent to which your communication is more or less effective. And I'm kind of a little bit at sea because I'm not really sure what effective means, right? And that's kind of what I'm looking for. So if the argument is instead, hey, look, if you stick with ABT, this will be an indicator of how argumentative something is. And then you get to make a call. Do you want to be more argumentative or don't you? Well, all right, fair enough. That's great.
Yeah.
But this is not a criticism. That's a less aggressive claim, and fair enough. That works.
Oh, Shirley, you got a comment there?
In science speak, we always get dinged for quote unquote dumbing something down, which I find interesting, given that the Feynman technique basically emphasizes getting as simple as you can. And that if you cannot explain it simply, you don't understand it. I mean, that's the basic premise behind that. And I think that where we get stuck with regard to all of this is around audience and purpose. Who are we talking to, and what do we want with them to do with what we tell them? Like I go to the lawyers, Doug, Dave, Doug.
Doug the lawyer.
Doug.
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 Yeah, it's Doug.
Okay. I go to the lawyers, and you have a section where you have to deal with the facts of the case. And that's one kind of speak. But another kind of speak is you want to save the guy from the electric chair. And Ann and but aren't going to necessarily save the guy from the electric chair. They're great in the facts of the case, but when you come to saving him from the electric chair, you've got to go emotive. You've got to somehow get sadly and other kinds of things that aren't as strong as but you've got to pull on different things for that audience. And I think that in many cases, we want to use the same tools for all these different people, but I don't think we can. And we have to, first of all, know who we're trying to talk to.
But I would offer up the warning with emotion, which is that and that's highly emotional is a disaster. You know, people don't know.
Oh, and is terrible.
Yes, and that happens all the
Terrible.
time.
I agree. I
Yeah.
agree. I
Yeah.
mean, the thing is, that doesn't draw anything.
I think the buts are where the emotion really lies.
Yeah.
The and is just the facts, the getting mired down in the facts. And I always teach lawyers, it's not about what you need the jury to know, and it's what you need them, it's how you need them to feel.
Well,
Yeah.
and we see the manifestation of stuff in lots of our data sets. And for example, we've done lots of documents from the world of research science compared to the New Yorker feature articles. And in the New Yorker feature articles, it's all buts. We calculated 2% of the contradiction drew on the word however. That was the most common synonym there. Whereas in some science papers, we found more howevers than buts. So scientists are wanting to equivocate. They're wanting to be as soft and diplomatic as possible. The New Yorker is wanting to reach the mass audience, and they're screaming but over and over again because that is the most powerful word. As I mentioned in the new book, Jerry Graff wrote me an email 5, 6 years ago. The guy authored this book one Sunday, and he just read an editorial in the New York Times. He said, "Is it not the case that but is probably the most powerful word in the English language because it changes the direction and it gets used by everybody day in, day out, all over the place." And that was exactly my thoughts in parallel at the same time. We had a long conversation about that. So this development of not just a sensitivity to but also the emergence of a few basic rules like this, because you're seeing more and more editorials. This is happening. It's converging. This is narrative selection. Last week, Ezra Klein had a whole editorial in the New York Times about the word and it was, by our perspective, it was kind of naive what he was just swinging in the dark about this word and didn't really kind of get most people don't see the narrative dimension of and. They see it as a quirky, word of agreement and things like that. So these are principles that are new and emerging, and we can trace the timeline back to only 1986 when Frank Daniel identified and but and therefore, and then 2011 when the South Park guys really gave it its first opening with their documentary. And then people now beginning to explore it more deeply. But I think it's a dynamic needed for a world of too much complexity now, too much information, and people who are figuring out how to weaponize obfuscation. And that's what the world is up against. Matthew, we got 8 minutes left on this, and then we got to close the door because we got to go over to who we're going to the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. But you got a couple people you want to call on?
Oh, yes. Dean, I promised you a spot ages ago. So have the spotlight.
No problem, because we've just been cycling through it, actually. So yeah, I mean, why is but more powerful than however? It's because it's short. It goes into your head in a syllable. And a lot of what we're talking about, I think, comes down to the basic reality that simpler communication is more powerful. And there are times when you don't want your communication to be as powerful, so you tend to use more diplomatic, more fuzzy words,
However,
tuning it to the audience. But
right.
if you want to be argumentative and make a emotional impact, you will be short, concise, and simple.
What has this done to Doug's signal there? Have we fried his brain?
Oh shit.
We're seeing multiple
What
frames.
happened?
The
Oh.
lawyers.
I knew Doug was max headroom all along. I knew it.
Exactly.
We can just
Jumped
use
into
more
that.
Doug. Clearly.
Okay, Matthew, home stretch here, 6 minutes. A couple other people to
Oh
call
yeah,
on.
Mike, you had a rebuttal, or you had something else you wanted to add earlier?
No, I thought that Doug used an interesting word when he described this narrative index. He called it a diagnostic tool, and I think that's important to remember.
Yes.
When I had a blood test a while ago, it came up with some numbers. One of the hematologists who saw it looked at it and said, "Oh, you need a bone marrow uh, biopsy. You need all this stuff." The next one came, looked at the same numbers, and said, "Oh, no, look at this number. Look at this. Look at here's what's happening." So he did what Liz did with Doug's, which is she looked at it and said, "No, we just got to look at it closer." I think if we try to make it more than a diagnostic tool, if we try to make it an absolute rule, then we wind up in trouble. But
Yes.
you get the response, and then it says, "Now that you've gotten that response, look at it."
Yes, exactly. And I don't think that you can fix a low NI analytically. I don't, and that's what ChatGPT was trying to do. Okay, here's 3 sentences in a row. I'm going to jam a button into each one of these things. It's not that simple. You have to get the low index, then you got to go back to the drawing board, I think, and reconceive, what is our overall structure? We're not managing to set this thing up with the proper amount of contradiction that we'd like to get. So it's got to be a little more holistic, I think, to fix it. Matthew, 5 minutes left.
Charles, you have a hand up.
Oh yeah, got to have Charles
Yeah,
weighing
yeah.
on something.
I was going to say I'm going to provide the great unifying theory of everything. Is that what I'm really, and this comes from Park, I think, originally. Really, what I care about with this ABT is at each step, does the audience care? And really, you're saying, does the audience care enough to read the next paragraph? And I read a paper yesterday, a scientific paper that did really well by always laying out, they used howevers, but they were saying, here's why this next paragraph matters. Here's why this issue matters. And using but is applying that, why should I care, to the argumentative large audience world, right? But there are different contexts according to audience. And ultimately, for me, the ABT is an expression of how do you reach the audience so that they care about what you're going to say next at every scale. And maybe a metric that measured that audience specific would be a more general tool.
Well, yeah.
Very hard to do, though, of course.
Exactly. That's the problem. Every time you think of a metric to do this, all these variables are coming in precisely, and then you start to slow things down. Matthew, 4 minutes ago.
I just want to, I one little note about Randall Julian's presentation. So in one of our sessions, one of our mini course sessions, I introduced the concept of team facing versus world facing ABTs. Oh, yeah. So this is where we talk about being tactical and diplomatic and the right ABT for the right audience. I have found that it is sometimes very important for a team to understand what their team-facing ABT is. This will often be an ABT where you don't worry about diplomacy, where you're just going to be brutally honest with each other. As Randall said, it's like a rah, rah, rah. Let's all get on the same page and yeah, we understand who we are and what we're fighting for. This ABT is blunt, brutally honest, and often not appropriate for the world. When you want to do a world-facing ABT, that's when you want to start dialing things back and being more diplomatic. What we're trying to do with this entire narrative index thing is trying to make you all more conscious and aware of what type of ABT it is that you have. Do you have a hugely argumentative, we're going to go out there and like bloody some noses and blacken some eyes ABT? Or do you have one that's a little bit more dialed back and we want to be more diplomatic on? Let's at least be a little bit more conscious and aware of what we're doing so we can be more tactical in the future.
That was excellent. That's a perfect wrap up right there. And for everybody, if you in the next week or two are using some of these things and come across some interesting stuff, let's probably do this again in 2 or 3 or 4 weeks from now when we've got another 5, because those 5 presentations I thought were really just right on the money. Each one had a different facet of the whole thing. And Park, that was great about ChatGPT. Randall, that was excellent with the shareholder newsletter. And the teaming of Liz and Doug was outstanding of the pattern and then the interpretation. And then lastly, Andy Reynolds, who's with the National Committee for Quality Assurance, a large medical assessment group in Washington, D.C., and has been one of these guys that got the ABT from square one about 2 years ago and a huge part of our group. And I thought that was an excellent question that he begged there that I think we've got to dig deeper into is there a risk when you get up to really high narrative index into the 30s and 40s, possibly, that you're entering into DHY, where you got so much contradiction going on, you're generating confusion. And I gotta say, from my experience of the last 10 years, looking at all these tons and tons of documents, the few that have reached all the way up there in the 40s, they've all been kind of crystal clear. You know, they've still, it's as if there's something going on with fierce focus, anger, and rage. Richard Nixon's first inaugural address, after having lost in 1960 and 1968, he finally got to give his inaugural address, and it scores a 46. And that speech is so focused, and you can feel the rage beneath the surface there of why did you people do this to me 8 years ago? Now I win. Now I get to change the events in the course of history. And in fact, the first two paragraphs are just stunning when you read that. He says sometimes things happen that change the course of history. Okay, so on that note, everybody keep thinking about this stuff, and we're going to do a series of these little symposia because I think this was really fun. Okay, thanks everybody. That was great. See you next time. Onward, and we got to go. See ya.